Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Raw podcast. Phil here, joined by my colleague James Copley. Unfortunately, this week we don't have a lovely win to talk about. We've instead got to pick through a bit of a shocker from a Sunderland perspective. We haven't said it very often this season, or indeed over the last 18 months or so, but today very much the case. So, yeah, James, I mean, there's not really too much to say about it, is there? First half was a bit of a mess. Second half a little bit better, but the game was pretty much gone. One of those days we haven't had to be critical too often this season, but it was just a bit of a shocker from a Sunderland perspective.
Yeah, it was. It was one of those rare occasions, wasn't it, where the manager gets it wrong in terms of his tactics and the team selection, and then Sunderland's players don't turn up on the day either. And I've spoken about this game with friends, and yes, the team selection can be wrong. Yes, the tactics can be wrong, but the one thing you don't want to see as a Sunderland fan is players not closing people down, which I thought we did see in the first half, and Sunderland just let the game get away from them. I'm not saying Granit Xhaka would have changed the result necessarily because Sunderland was so below par, but when you go 1-0 down or 2-0 down at the London Stadium, I think he helps manage that game a little bit better. You don't necessarily fall 3-0 down before half-time, and you do have a little bit of a better chance. I just thought Sunderland lacked that leadership, and tactically as well. Obviously, there's been a lot said about Traore in his position, stepping into midfield, but at times playing wider as well. I think Xhaka's absence just goes to show to me how good he is at sort of conducting Sunderland's structure on the field as like an on-field manager, really, because it all sort of fell apart. There were distances between players, between midfielders, whereas Xhaka's very good at sort of beckoning players back in. So yeah, a bit of a calamity, really. But Sunderland have learned from every defeat they've had this season. Still haven't lost back-to-back games. They've won every time they've lost in the Premier League this season. Now the only unbeaten team at home this season after Arsenal lost to Manchester United last night. So I still think there's a lot of reasons to be cheery. We were always going to get days like this in the Premier League, Phil. We said it after Sheffield United at Wembley. If you'd have said to us then that at some point next season you will find yourself 3-0 down at halftime, you probably would have thought, yeah, I think so at some point, because we're a newly promoted side still adjusting to the division. I think what's sort of altered expectations is just how good Sunderland have been this season. There's a bit of how poor West Ham have been thrown in there this season as well. But a bad day at the office, I still think there's loads of reasons to be cheerful, and I don't think there's any reason to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose just to kind of play devil's advocate, I mean, I certainly thought, in reflection, without Xhaka, that, reinforcing the midfield, I think would have been the way to go from the start. I suppose the kind of the other side of this is that we sat on this podcast a week ago and talked about how well Traore had played as that kind of right winger, and it had worked really, really well. Sometimes players just have an off day, don't they? And I thought Hume just had one of those. And on the other flank, I mean, Reynildo, it's the first time I've seen him have a bad game for Sunderland. I know the Aston Villa game he got sent off, but that was kind of one instant in the game. And, that first half, Jared Bowen, I've not seen anyone play like that against Reynildo this season. And he was fortunate not to get sent off. So I think tactically, I do think it was an error, but I do think there was something else going on here where just an unusually large number of Sunderland players were just nowhere near it in the first half.
I'm interested in the debate around Hume as well, because you're quite right to point out we did praise him last week on the podcast, so it would be hypocritical of us to absolutely hammer him now. I still think he can perform that role, but interested to hear what you thought of it from the ground. But with the captaincy going to him as well in the absence of Granit Xhaka, it just all looked a little bit too much for him, obviously trying to lead the side, and then one thing goes wrong and he just couldn't string a pass together, and it felt like the game sort of really got into his head. And I just wonder if the role he was being asked to play tactically, the fact that he was captain, the fact that things started to go wrong quite quickly, the fact that he's still pretty inexperienced in the Premier League, the fact that he's still relatively young as well. We forget that he's been around for ages, but he's only 23. It felt like, to me, it was just one of those perfect storm moments for Traore. But we shouldn't forget that he's been an exemplary servant for us, and I still believe he can do that role going forward in certain games. West Ham perhaps wasn't the time for it. And I think as well, we don't want to be revisionist either. When that team sheet dropped, I'm posting gifs of 4-4-2 and Mike Bassett and all that sort of stuff. I was quite pleased to see Mayenda up front against Broby. I didn't have too many complaints about the tactical setup beforehand because I thought West Ham were there to be got at. So you can't criticise too heavily. Yes, you can point out things went wrong and we'll learn from them, but I've been surprised by just how up in arms some people have been about the selection, the tactics, and the performance, because I don't really remember too many people saying that this wouldn't work before the game, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, you could see the kind of vision, if you like, in terms of the first 10, 15 minutes of the game before Somerville's goal, where Sunderland looked quite bright, really. And, West Ham playing a 4-4-2, obviously, that there's going to be a lot of space on the break. I think, as I said, look, I think when you're watching the game sort of play out, and especially towards the end of the first half, it really felt like another midfielder was kind of needed in there. But I think you're right to point out that I think had you known before the game that Xhaka was going to be absent, I think most people would have said, oh, well, I would bring Traore in. But I don't think there would have been too much criticism of the idea of using it as an opportunity to pick an attacking side and pick Mayenda. And I just think Hume had one of those days. Is there a little bit of fatigue? I haven't played so much football this season, the extra kind of physicality and intensity of the Premier League, I'm not too sure. But I think the Xhaka one's interesting. He obviously was a massive miss. No two ways about that. I guess he was on the pitch when it unravelled at Brentford. So it can't kind of purely be down to that. I don't know. Do you think there's anything more fundamental to worry about? Or do you think it's just one of those where Sunderland have got away with it once or twice away from home, where the game could have gone like this, but the opposition probably wasn't clinical enough? I'm inclined to think that they've got to get a lot better in the long term away from home. But, I'm probably not feeling kind of the need to kind of overreact to this one in particular.
Yeah, I think in terms of this season, Sunderland's away form, it hasn't been spectacular. We've had wins against Chelsea and Nottingham Forest, but we've had some decent points on the road as well. Liverpool away, clean sheet at Brighton stands out. Yes, we've suffered a few tough afternoons as well. Manchester United away from home, obviously against West Ham and Brentford as well. But I was talking to Conor Bromley about this in a show he did for his YouTube channel yesterday, and Sunderland are 15th in the away form table, which for a newly promoted club is about where you'd expect them to be. I think we're all probably missing that it's really, really difficult to go away in the Premier League and get results. It's known as the best league in the world for a reason. It is really, really tricky. I think Sunderland have done well to get the results they've gotten. The home form has been a real bonus, but I wonder, because of that home form, it's sort of set an unrealistic expectation in terms of Sunderland on the road. But I feel quite relaxed about it. It's not ideal to be shipping 3 goals and a half, clearly and obviously, but I just feel like that can happen to anybody at any time in the Premier League, and we do see this actually quite regularly. We are in our first season back in the Premier League. Labrie said it after the game, and he did cop a little bit of flack for it, but I don't think he was excusing the performance, but he pointed towards it being a young team and an inexperienced team in terms of Premier League football. I still think that's a valid argument. They are learning tactically in terms of their mentality, in terms of going again week after week after week. It is tough, and there will be blips along the road. So it's not something I'm overly concerned about unless we see regular drubbings on the road, which we haven't this season at all. It's happened 2 or 3 times, but I think Sunderland's away form is about where you would expect a newly promoted team to be honest, and it's still shaping up to be an interesting second half to the campaign.
I suppose the one stat that would jump out, I think you're absolutely right about the points. It's no shame for a newly promoted team. I think Leeds have 6 points away from home this season, Burnley 5, I think. So I think that kind of puts in perspective. I think 6 goals away from home. I think only Wolves have a worse record. I think that's the obvious area, isn't it, where you could identify and say someone clearly need to get better. I don't want to dwell too much on the game because I feel like that's probably not what people will want to listen to the most, because I think it kind of speaks for itself in terms of a first half where just everything went a little bit wrong. I want to throw it forward as much as possible, and I think a couple of kind of interesting talking points moving forward from it. One is we know Xhaka is going to miss the Burnley game, so he needs a long period of rest basically, and then he'll be reassessed. So we know he's going to be missing for 1 game. I suppose at this point there's a chance he maybe miss more. So it throws the obvious question in terms of how do you replace him, and I guess that's the interesting one, because we don't have a like-for-like replacement in the squad. in theory, Dan Neil could be that person, but it seems unlikely he'll still be at the club when Sunderland kick off against Burnley. So what's your kind of feeling on the answer to that particular riddle? Because that's obviously going to be a massive part of what Lebris has to get right this week.
I don't think we have like for like. I think you're completely right. I think Traore would probably be the closest, apart from Dan Neil, who is obviously set to leave the club, probably played his last game for Sunderland. I am comforted by the fact, though, that despite not having Xhaka available, I do think there are potential solutions to Sunderland's problem, both tactically and now from a personnel standpoint. They do have Traore back. They do have Habib Diarra back. Enzo Lefebvre is a really good player. Can we slightly adjust his role? Noah Sadiqi's still in and around there. So I feel like there are the bodies and the options there for Lebris to field a really strong midfield three. How that looks in terms of composition, whether they can gel and work together in the way that sort of Xhaka, Sadiqi and Lefebvre have, or Habib Diarra, Xhaka and Sadiqi did right at the beginning of the season, remains to be seen. But I don't know what you think, Phil. I think Lebris has got enough available to him to potentially find a solution to that problem against Burnley at home. I think there's enough there now for Sunderland to get a foothold in that game in terms of who's available.
Yeah, I mean, my instinct, I thought the blend of the midfield three in the second half, and I know you've got to put that second half into context because West Ham United are 3-0 up, so they're fairly happy to kind of sit on the game and sit on their lead. But I thought the blend of that midfield three looked really nice. Obviously, ideally, you don't want to play Noah Sadiqi as a 6 because you're probably limiting his sort of what he can do, kind of getting around the pitch. But Diarra and Lefebvre's 8, I think, brings you a hell of a lot in terms of quality and energy. And I thought Sunderland moved the ball quite nicely for quite large parts of the second half. I suppose the challenge there is, and this is what becomes interesting in terms of looking ahead to the Burnley game, is we obviously have an issue at the moment where with Bertrand Traore injured, nobody is really putting their hands up and saying, I have to be one of the two wingers. And I guess the balance is, do you bring a Traore in, which allows you maybe to play Lefebvre or Diarra out wide? Is that a solution? I think that's probably the biggest debate, really, because I don't think, as you say, I don't think there's any doubt that someone have centre midfielders who can step in. I'm probably inclined to try and keep Lefebvre and Diarra in the middle of the pitch, where I think there could be real game changers. And I don't know, maybe give a Dinger an opportunity against Burnley, a home game where you're hoping that you'll have opportunities, and see if he can kind of seize that as he did against Leeds. But I think that's probably the issue at the moment without Traore, is that you feel as if maybe a solution is to play your midfielders out wide, but then obviously you're losing a lot as well. So I think that's the really tricky balance that Lebris has got.
And I think with Lefebvre as well, is that he's been so good as that sort of hybrid 8-10 that you don't really want to move him out onto the left again unless you have to. I know Mundell didn't have his best game, but I don't mind Diarra on the right-hand side of attack, to be honest. I wouldn't be adverse to that. I get what you're saying. He was good in the middle, but I think he could sort of tuck in, playing that right-hand channel, get on the ball a little bit. I wouldn't be adverse to that, but yeah, as was both mentioned, I think Lebris has got options, and this is the sort of tactical challenge that he quite enjoys. So I think there's enough there. I think it's going to be tough against Burnley. Don't get me wrong, but I think we've got the players now to try and make something happen. And again, I was talking to Connor on his show, but I think the real challenge for this team while Xhaka is out is, can you go and do it without him? Do you want to be known as the Granit Xhaka team? Is Granit Xhaka the one carrying you all, or are you all there on merit yourselves? Can you perform? Can you win games in the Premier League? And to me, that should be the motivation for them now to really kick on.
And the other kind of interesting part of this puzzle, and something that I thought we should chat about a little bit, because it was a big talking point of the weekend, is an interesting one, is obviously Traore. Again, I think important not to rewrite history too much in terms of, as you said, it's easy to say in hindsight, but at the time the team sheet dropped, I think it was a bit of a surprise he didn't come in with Xhaka out. But again, I think people could understand the attacking formation. Probably more of a surprise in a way that he didn't come on at right back at the end of the game when Mukiele came off, because that's obviously his strongest position. And it's a really interesting one with Traore, because I don't think there's anything particularly significant to it in terms of we've seen Lebris use Traore loads. He obviously likes him, he obviously rates him. But we've spoken a lot about this kind of being, in the long term, a no-brainer for Sunderland to sign Traore, because he's versatile, he's experienced, he's athletic, he's got quality. But he must be looking at this and thinking, I don't know where my long-term role is at Sunderland.
Well, yeah, and it's a World Cup year, and he's not playing a great deal either, which won't be great for him. I think he's a really good player. I like him a lot. he's almost struggled from that versatility issue, hasn't he? Where he's so good, he's not been able to nail down a starting spot anywhere, which is a shame, really, because he is clearly quite talented. I would have brought him on at half time, to be honest, against West Ham. He's the substitution I thought Lebris should have made. I would have dropped him into the 6 role, perhaps changed Sunderland's formation a little bit. I thought it was weird he didn't come on at all. And I thought it was a bit strange, actually, that he played for the 21s on, what was it, Friday night or Thursday night? Or Wednesday night, I can't even remember now. He played at centre-back, which I thought was a little bit strange. I can't see him getting a game at centre-back anytime soon unless Sunderland get unlucky with injuries. So, yeah, it's strange. I don't really know where he fits in, but I feel like he should be playing more minutes. I mean, he's been left on the bench a couple of times, hasn't he, this season? And it is strange. You wonder what sort of got on. Lebris, obviously, you asked him the question, didn't you, Phil, after the game? But he didn't say much on it. He confirmed that there's no sort of injury niggles. So I am a bit perplexed, given how talented he is, how tactically versatile he is, that he wasn't brought on, to be honest.
Yeah, I think especially at right back. I mean, you mentioned there about him not coming on at half time, and you can at least understand from the perspective of, Sunderland did go back to that 4-3-3, and Siddiqui was the one who dropped a bit deeper and did fine. So, I can see the logic of that one. And, but when you're changing your right back and you've got a guy who's kind of broke through, made his reputation as a right back in a title-winning Feyenoord side, it just seemed like an interesting decision. And sounds like a negative on 09, which it's absolutely not, because, Luke O'Nine's had plenty of praise over the years on this podcast, but he's been a centre-half, really, for Sunderland for quite a long period of time now. So I just thought that was an interesting one, and I just wonder how that one will develop. As I say, not suggesting there's anything particularly going on behind the scenes. I don't think that's the case, but I just think he'll be an interesting one in terms of how he assesses his future going forward, because he'll be looking at it when...
Would you want to sign at the moment?
Well, that's what I mean. I'm sure he feels as if he's getting minutes here and there, but what's his kind of role in this team and the club in the future? I think it's a really interesting one. We'll move on a little bit, but I just want to end by saying, if you're sitting here right now, what would you kind of do against Burnley? How would you reshuffle things?
Oh God, there's a question. Obviously, Roof's in goal. Ronaldo deserves the chance to sort of get back on track. I think you keep the centre-backs the same. I think Nordy goes to right back. Midfield, I think I'd probably go Diarra out on the right wing, and then I'd get Siddiqui, Lafay, and I'd get Traore just behind them. Left-hand side, I'd probably persist with Mundell, and then it's Brian Broby up front for me. That's sort of what I'd do, 4-3-3. Keep the game tight for 10, 15 minutes and then try and hit them. And Sunderland do have options on the bench as well to change games now, which is positive. What would you do, Phil?
Yeah, I think it's a tricky one, because I would probably bring a Dinger in for the reasons I outlined before. I mean, that's not necessarily a shade on Mundell at all. I think if we take Mundell's 3 starts in perspective, I thought he was decent against Everton, probably a bit unlucky not to get on the score sheet. What was the game after that? Crystal Palace. I thought he was a bit quiet in the first half, very good in the second half, and then I thought he had a tough first half on Saturday, like pretty much everyone. So I don't think there's any concern there. I think you've got to give him a much longer period of time before you make any judgments on him. But I just like the idea of, can you get a Dinger in the team? We know he can make something happen in the final third. The back four, I agree with you. I think, Ronaldo has to stay in despite Saturday. Mukele, I think, is building a bit of a head of steam at right back in terms of contributing in the final third as well. I think the question for me is, as you say, I think it's the big one. Do you move Diarra out to the right, or do you try and go with, continue as you were with Siddiqui, Lafay and Diarra? I think I would probably do that. But that leaves me a difficult question in terms of who plays on the right flank, and I'm not really sure what the answer to that one is. So I think that's going to be really interesting to kind of see how that one shakes out over the last week. And it does underline...
In agreement that the Diarra starts, though, both.
I think so. I think we spoke about it last week in terms of, I was really happy that you stuck with a kind of way that Sunderland had against Crystal Palace and sort of make Diarra and his opportunity. But I think Xhaka's injury changes things, and he was so clearly one of Sunderland's best players in the second half in terms of what he brought. I think it's just one of those, football changes quickly, doesn't it? And I'd be amazed if off the back of that 45 minutes and a full week of training, you didn't see Diarra in the side in some capacity.
And we don't necessarily have another player that does what he does in midfield, because he carries the ball so well. Lafay and Siddiqui can do it, but he really goes sort of linearly, doesn't he, from one spot straight up to the other, and it's quite nice to watch actually. But I do think his athleticism as well as intelligence, it does offer Sunderland something else. I actually really liked him in the 2 or 3 games he played before he got injured. It's a real shame because I think if he hadn't had that injury, I think he could be really tearing it up now.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that was the big positive to come from Saturday. I think that's, obviously we've focused on the negatives for totally understandable reasons. But, it is the cliche, but it really is like a new signing to drop a £30 million midfielder of his caliber kind of into this team at this stage of the season. So, yeah, I think we're broadly in agreement. I think the big decision, isn't it, that we think is whether you bring Traore into midfield or whether you kind of go with 2 of the wingers. Talby's the interesting one. I mean, Talby, we know he's better off the left, but he absolutely is an option off the right. He played there a lot in pre-season. So I guess that's an interesting one. But yeah, I think pretty clear whether.
He's shown tremendous loyalty to Trey Hume, which isn't undeserved. I mean, is there a chance that he sticks with him?
100% there is. He played that exact role against Crystal Palace at the stadium like 9 days ago and was excellent. And, played a really important part in the win. So I think there's absolutely a chance he goes and does that as well. So it's going to be really interesting to see how he kind of reflects on that. It's a week till the end of the transfer window, James. Obviously, we kind of knew it wasn't going to be a really explosive window for Sunderland. It's played out as we expected on that front. We said it a few times. They haven't done much January business in windows where they've been really struggling, and we felt they've been desperate for it. So it was obvious there wasn't going to be too much. But what would you like to see in the last week of the window? I mean, we've talked a bit about it, but I do think there's a real argument that if you can, a midfielder, a defensive midfielder, I think would be a fairly savvy addition for me if you can do that.
Yeah, definitely. Obviously, Xhaka's absence sort of underlines that need at some point whether Sunderland can get a deal over the line. I think it's interesting how that ties with Dan Neil, obviously Anthony Patterson as well. You'd think Sunderland would need to perhaps bring reinforcements in before those 2 were allowed to leave. I think Patterson probably more so than Dan Neil. I think Dan Neil could go without somebody coming in, but it does leave Sunderland short. Injuries happen towards the end of a long season. Again, as you allude to, we're not expecting it to be massively busy or frantic. It could be interesting. You do wonder if there's a little surprise. I know a lot of people have noted Louis Dreyfus's quotes. Was it before the Everton game, first Monday night football of the season when Sunderland were doing quite well? Louis Dreyfus says there is money to spend in January if Sunderland are in a good position and the right deals come up. Sunderland are in a good position, but are the right deals going to come up? We don't know. It is notoriously hard to get good players in January for a decent fee. What you don't want to see Sunderland do, or what I don't want to see Sunderland do, is go kamikaze and then hamstring themselves for next season or the season after. I know the financial rules and regulations are going to change and adjust somewhat, but I think they've earned a level of trust now when it comes to finances and transfers. I think they'll do the right thing. Hopefully, we don't regret it by the end of the season. I think right wing would be the other position that I can feel people screaming at the phones and laptops when we're talking about this. We've spoken about the winger situation quite often. I'm not sure getting a new winger just automatically solves Sunderland's problem in terms of the playing style and all that sort of stuff. So there's a lot wrapped up in there. But it is nice to be in a transfer window where you're not feeling that desperation, which we have in recent years, in my opinion. So it is a bit unnerving for us covering it because we're usually used to quite a few links and in times gone by quite a lot of activity or failed activity, but it doesn't really feel that dramatic to us at the moment, does it, Phil? It's been a fairly quiet January by Sunderland standards in terms of just the amount of players that have been linked has been quite low, and it's been totally different from the summer transfer window, which was just story after story after story and a lot of uncertainty and a lot of different links. But yeah, I think being conservative in this window is probably a smart strategy, unless something special does come up that you can pull the trigger on.
I mean, I think just going back slightly to what you said there about Patterson and Neil, I think you've got to let Dan Neil just move on either way, haven't you? Because I think at this point, whatever the rights and wrongs of it are, whatever the reasons of it are, having essentially not used him at any opportunity really, even when there's been kind of gaps in the team, I don't think you can say we need a replacement before we let you go. I think at this point they've made their almost stance pretty clear, haven't they? They just have to let him. Patterson's different because Reece could get injured tomorrow, and that could have a massively detrimental impact on the season if there wasn't a kind of good replacement instead of Patterson. But I think with Neil, I think you just shake hands now, don't you? And regardless of whether someone can sign another midfielder or not, I don't see a world in which they can realistically say no, we need to keep you unless we can sign somebody else.
No, you'd hope not, but then sometimes you might get to Burnley on Saturday and something silly might happen in the game, and then you never know, do you? So hopefully that doesn't happen, and I'm just thinking of worst case scenarios there. But he deserves to go and play somewhere. Dan Neil, we've spoken about him a lot on this podcast. We've defended him. We're both massive fans of his. A double promotion winner. I think the message when he leaves really should be thank you, all the best, rather than concentrating on a contract dispute, which I believe, from what I've seen and heard, has been handled in a very dignified manner. There's been no media briefings. There's not a lot of information that's come out from either side. It's been handled very respectfully. I'll go back to maybe when Jack Clarke was leaving the club and the exploits of Ian Hart and all of that sort of stuff and the noise around that. That wasn't a very good look at all. But this has been handled very well. I think Dan Neil's probably put Sunderland first. He hasn't been speaking to people. It doesn't sound like his agent's been speaking to people. And that's the sort of thing that I think both sides deserve a lot of respect for, because it's very easy to tell when a club has fallen out with the player and everything's coming out and people are being briefed left, right and centre. But this hasn't happened in this situation, and that's not always noticed, I don't think, because it obviously doesn't catch the eye. But I think it's probably worth mentioning that both sides have acted really, really well during this, despite the fact that, Dan Neil will have been hugely disappointed in the events that have unfolded. He had the captaincy, that's now gone. He's played 13 Premier League minutes over 3 games, hasn't really had a chance to lose the shirt. I'm not saying it is the wrong decision, because it's very hard to argue against Sunderland's midfielders currently, is it? I'm not sure where Dan Neil would have played. So yeah, I think he deserves our respect for that. I really, really do.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think it's just one of those scenarios where, if Daniel had decided to sign a contract in the Championship years, maybe someone would have been more minded to give him more minutes this season, but he didn't for understandable reasons at that time, and things change in football. But so just to kind of wrap up the transfer chat, centre midfield and right winger, I think we could say that Sunderland don't desperately need one. I think they would benefit from one in both of those positions if they can find them. But as far as you're concerned, is that pretty much it in terms of where you think in the short term this squad could be improved? Because we know in the long run they're going to have to keep investing in every position to keep pace with Premier League teams. But do you feel right now, between now and the end of the season, that's pretty much it really, where Sunderland could actually improve the team right now realistically?
I think so. I think the other position of two positions of concern perhaps would be left back. So not in the very short term, because Dennis Serkin's still got 6 months left on his deal. It doesn't sound like there's any chance of him leaving now. But I think a decision needs to be made. Are you going to offer him a contract and keep him at the club, or are we going to have to go and find, a young left back to be Reinildo's understudy? I think that is a position that needs some attention at some point. Might not necessarily happen this January, but again, I reiterate, if something was to come up, like Mundell was in the door before Jack Clarke is the classic example we always use. Could Sunderland do something like that? Again, easier said than done. Very nitpicky, but that's something Sunderland will need to keep an eye on. The other thing is, I guess, despite having, sort of 3 strikers at the club, Mayenda, Wilson and Broby, who I all like, I think they all bring something very different, and I all think they can have an impact on Sunderland's season. A lot of people will be crying out for goals. It's the hardest thing to buy. They are very expensive. The fact that Wilson Isidor has scored 4 Premier League goals and his last one came in October, yet he's been valued at £25 million by some outlets, will tell you that it's a really hard and difficult position to recruit in. But maybe it's not in January, but long term, is that something that Sunderland will need to look at as well? Brian Broby's doing brilliantly. And I want to see Mayenda developed. And I like Wilson as well. I'd like to see him stay at the club. But I think you've always got to be thinking about these things and asking these questions, despite the fact that I think we all like these players, don't we? Especially the front 3 of Mayenda, Broby and Isidor. They've given us they've all given us some great moments. Broby's absolutely coming into his own, but there's always the want for more, isn't there? The temptation to want more and more goals, and that's what we're like as football fans, I guess.
Yeah, and I guess the thing about the right winger is obviously, there's an argument in that Traore will be back in a few weeks, and we've seen him do well. But I guess the difference with Traore is that generally he only plays an hour. So you could make a strong argument that there is a real need for another kind of natural in that position, because it's an area where Sunderland are lacking. Whereas, as you say up front, you do have three there. I mean, we'll end just chatting about Isidor for a couple of minutes. I mean, it's not something I would be rushing into, and I wouldn't be doing it this month, because I think, as well as having seen over a period of time, he's got really good attributes and an eye for goal. It's also a massive figure in that dressing room, which I think gets lost a little bit in terms of the integration of all the players who came into the club in the summer, and how important the player Isidor was in that. But I guess it is also one of those where in football in 2026, every single player has their price. And I guess this is what it comes down to, a guy who is ultimately behind Broby in the pecking order. I suppose there is probably a price where, if it materialised in the next 7 days, it would make it awkward for Sunderland.
I think so. When I saw the price of 25 million, I don't really want Wilson to go, but I do think that is really, really good money for a player you've probably spent, maybe tops £5 million on transfer fees wise.
My gut is I don't see anyone bidding that in this window. So I
guess that's the valuation, isn't it?
Yeah, I suppose a more interesting question maybe would be, if a bid came in of, say, 15 million, where does that then leave Sunderland? I think that's what's the interesting dilemma is, because I'm sitting here saying I think it would be a bad idea to let Isidor go in this window, but I can understand that if a Premier League club who is panicking a little bit and really needs a striker comes in with that price, I can see why that's then awkward for Sunderland, given that at the moment the reality is that he's not in the team.
Yeah, but then I think Sunderland's stance is probably quite clear in that regard, isn't it? It's you are going to have to get to 20 or 25 million to get him in January, because he's probably worth 15, 16, 17, but we don't want to let him go. We don't have to let him go. He's on, he'll have 3 or 4 years left on his deal. I can't remember exactly. So it has to work for Sunderland, doesn't it? And we know that they will put the club first. So I can't see him going unless the team does get really desperate, as you say. Perhaps in the summer is a more natural end to his Sunderland career, depending on how badly or well the second half of the season goes. But if he was to go, you'd have to have a replacement surely coming in, whether on loan or you've got to buy somebody else, because going into the second half of the season with just Broby and Mayenda, when injuries can happen, I don't think that would be too clever when Sunderland are struggling for goals anyway. And I guess in terms of Wilson Isidor, it just goes to show how fine the margins are in football, because he was a hero in October. He'd scored 4 goals. He was absolutely flying. He goes through a little bit of a dip in form. He has a massive chance against Liverpool, which Chiesa does really well to salvage. And then he has a big chance against Manchester City not long after, and world-class goalkeeper Donnarumma saves it quite well. Could he have done better with both of those chances? Perhaps. But now he's on a massive goal drought and he's not in the team, and Broby's sort of taking his shirt. So you can be a hero 1 month and way down the pecking order the next. It's just how football works, and it's crazy, really.
And Labrise did point out last week as well, when he was asked about this, that he still had a similar season last year where, he had a dip around this time of year, and he obviously was then a pretty important player during sort of the playoff campaign. So yeah, I think all of that combined is what makes me think it's probably unlikely that something will happen on that front in the next 7 days. But I think you can feel, can't you, that there's a lot of moving parts, and that while we may not end with, Sunderland spending vast amounts of money, it feels like there is going to be a lot happens, just because that juggling kind of act that they're going through at the moment is going to be really interesting. So I think we'll leave it there, James, unless you have any final thoughts on the last week of the window.
No, not really. I think on the winger situation, Phil, I do think we need to sometimes add a little bit of context in terms of Talby's still 20 years old, has been to AFCON. He's building up a little bit of a head of steam before he went to that tournament. Hasn't really played. He's come back in, so he's had a very stop-start season. Traore was looking decent until he got injured. Mundell, again, quite young, first season in the Premier League. Had an injury as well, missed a lot of football last season. For me, the real disappointment's been Adingra. So my sort of thought is that I'm not sure just throwing money at that position is going to necessarily solve Sunderland's problem, because it is hard for wingers to play, 1 in this team and 2 in the Premier League at the moment, although I will accept that sort of West Ham made a mockery of that against Sunderland. But then I would argue that Sunderland sort of made it quite easy for them. So I know we all get excited in the transfer window, but I'm not convinced the argument for throwing money at the right wing position is necessarily the right one at the moment. I think in the summer it's a little bit of a different conversation.
Oh, it definitely is in the summer. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious, isn't it? They're going to have to invest in the summer just for that reason that you mentioned in terms of, you know, their level of investment in those positions at the moment isn't massive. I think the problem probably you've got in terms of the next 4 to 5 months, which is where the argument for strengthening would come in, is that you have 3 really talented young players in Mundle, and Adingra is still a young player. Don't forget that, just because he's played Premier League football for Brighton and Telby, who all look like you want to give them a run and you want to give them patience and feel they could be a good player. But you want to do it on the left because you feel as if they're not as comfortable on the right, and you may be knocking their confidence and momentum. And I think that's maybe the issue, is that it feels like you aren't helping any of them by pushing one onto the right where they're not as comfortable. And when Traore is not absent, it then feels like a real issue. So I think it's one where I agree with you. I don't think chucking money at it, I've said that for a while, is going to suddenly transform something. But I just wonder if there's something that can be done on that, and thereby you're able to at least give these younger guys time in their proper position. And I agree with you. I think if you're able to do that, then I think you'll see some positive results from them. So it's going to be really interesting to see where Sunderland land on that one.
And we do have loan spots open as well, which is quite interesting. Incoming loan spots, anyway.
Yeah, and that could definitely be a solution, isn't it? You know, especially if there's kind of one of those maybe slightly younger players from a big club who needs some minutes, that could be
surely Chelsea have about 12 players we can pick from.
Well, that's it, isn't it? Yeah, and they owe Sunderland a favour, don't they? Although they're getting Brian Broby in worked out pretty well in the end. So yeah, it's going to be really interesting as ever, James. Thanks for your company, and thanks everyone who's been watching, whether it's live on our various platforms or listening back to the podcast. We really appreciate it. I have a feeling there's going to be loads of stuff coming this week, James. So we may well be re-emerging at some point for various reaction to different things. So until we see you, which we suspect will be very, very, very soon, thanks as ever for watching and for listening to the Raw podcast.